Inflation is plummeting. Incomes are rising fast. The roaring economy is roaring like never before. Gasoline, which reached a peak of over $6 a gallon in some states under my predecessor, it was quite honestly a disaster, is now below $2.30 a gallon in most states, and in some places, $1.99 a gallon. And when I visited the great state of Iowa just a few weeks ago, I even saw $1.85 a gallon for gasoline. In 12 months, I secured commitments for more than $18 trillion pouring in from all over the globe. The price of eggs is down 60%. Madam Secretary, thank you. The cost of chicken, butter, fruit, hotels, automobiles, rent is lower today than when I took office by a lot. And even beef, which was very high, is starting to come down significantly. Just hold on a little while. We're getting it down. And soon you will see numbers that few people would think were possible to achieve just a short time ago.
A lot to sift through there as the Speaker of the House nodded along. We'll correct some of the information you just heard there. Real GDP growth in 2025 was down to 2.2%. In 2024, the last year of Joe Biden's presidency, U.S. gross domestic product grew 2.8%. The president also claimed there to have brought in $18 trillion in investment. As Morning Joe economic analyst Steve Ratner has pointed out time and time again on this show, the White House website itself cited only $9.6 trillion, and even that is an exaggeration, relying on pledges made from countries that may never materialize. As for gas prices, in no state yesterday was the average below $2.30 a gallon. The nationwide average is $2.94 a gallon. Daniel Dale of CNN points out only the tiniest fraction of stations across the country have gas prices anywhere near what the president claims. While the average price of some grocery items like eggs and bread have come down, others spiking. The cost of beef, notably, that has risen significantly. The president also touting a retirement savings plan, but he actually was referring to the Savers Match program, a piece of bipartisan legislation signed by President Biden. One more item not related to the economy. The president claimed the man accused of killing a woman on a train in Charlotte last year was in the country because of open border policy. Suspect, though, actually was born in Charlotte. So, Jonathan Lemire, in a speech that is 2 hours long, those are just 4 or 5 fact checks. As Joe said at the top of the show, we could spend all 4 of our hours doing that. But interesting that the president trying so hard to lean into the economy, which is a real weakness for him right now.
Yeah, no question. And I'm continually struck by just how there's such a disconnect with what he says and what most Americans are feeling, and therefore telling pollsters. You know, as you say rightly, Willie, I mean, he's really underwater on the economy right now, which in 2024, that was sort of his central campaign pledge, was to get prices down, to battle inflation. You know, he always paints a rosy picture of the economy in his first term, and it was pretty good. Nowhere near as good as he says, but it was pretty good, and he did a good job selling it. So Americans had this sort of nostalgia for it pre-COVID. You know, and now he's not delivering what he promised. And that fact check was good. He also ticked through a couple things where prices have dropped. It's true hotel rooms have gone down slightly. Most of the other things he mentioned haven't. There have been slight increases or stayed flat. And, you know, President Trump in his pre-politics life, and certainly here in office, he knows the power of repetition. He knows the power of saying the same thing over and over and over again, sort of trying to assert his own reality, convincing others and maybe even himself what he's saying is true, even when it's not. And Joe, that was last night. This felt like a rally speech. This felt like something he would say at any other time. You know, he said it maybe a little louder with a more grander backdrop at the State of the Union, but it's simply not true. And Americans know that. And outside of perhaps his hardcore base, you know, who will believe anything he says, most Americans know the economy is not booming like he says. Prices are still high. They're still hurting.
Well, you know, you're talking about he's always done this. It reminds me at the beginning of Morning Joe, you know, when The Apprentice was out, he would fax to us, or I think it was faxes. He would fax to us, say, here are the ratings for last week. Apprentice, #1 again. And he would circle it, and it would be like number 18 or 19. And I'd sit there and I'd like go, I don't understand. Mika, can you? What? I don't understand. And we'd keep going back and forth. And pretty soon we just figured out no matter what it was, hit facts it say, Prentice, number one again. Well, you have the same thing that's happening here, except we're talking about the future of this country. And look at the economy. I mean, the economy grew at a faster clip under Joe Biden, I think, all 4 years than it did last year. It grew at 2.2%. And mind you, there are a lot of countries who would gladly have an economy that grows at 2.2%, though I will say our stock market lagged behind most stock markets worldwide. But, you know, David French, I've been to quite a few of these things. And I will say that if a president got up and just lied through his teeth, I wouldn't be sitting there clapping like Mike Johnson and like the other Republicans. This goes back to our tribe. Like, how do they clap? I mean, yes, we can talk about the demagoguery. That is absolutely shameful. We can talk about all of the things that are absolutely shameful. But here we have just simple facts. When Donald Trump says the price of beef is going up and they are going down, and we know it's skyrocketing going up, and they applaud, that's pretty much a lie. They're lying to their constituents. They're lying to America. When Donald Trump talks about these other issues, when he talks about inflation and how we inherited 9% inflation from Joe Biden and I brought it down, that's a lie. I even saw Stephen Moore going out and tweeting something, again, a member of, you know, the old tribe who I used to work with on balancing the budget and cutting taxes. But you go through on the economy lie after lie after lie after lie after lie. Donald Trump says it. That's what he does. Right? That's what he does. So the question is not what he does. It's the reaction by Republicans, reaction of our former tribes members. And they sit there and they jump up and they applaud for things they do. I'll tell you what, in all my years there, I did not stand unless I wanted to stand. And if somebody was lying, if, you know, a Republican president was lying, I would cross my arms and I would grimace and I would stay seated. These people don't do it.
Joe, you're really hitting on something important here, because from the beginning of this Trump phenomenon, you've had Trump, and Trump is Trump. It was the same kind of speech he's been giving forever and ever. But what gives him power is the love that the people have for him. That's what gives him his power. And the thing that was so telling is it's not just this applause, it's also this, it looks like delight, actual delight that they take when he says some of these things, and especially when he engages in these very personal attacks from that podium. So it's gone from, and we've said this 1,000 times, people saying, I'm voting for Trump in spite of all of that. I don't like all of that, but I like other things. To the reality is now a lot of Trump's core base, and right there in that chamber was, you know, were the representatives of Trump's core base, that Trump's core base loves him because of all of this. But, you know, I think the American people are getting tired of it again. They got tired of it before. I think they're getting tired of it again, perhaps a little bit earlier. And you cannot lie your way out of people's experiences. They're going to still believe their own experiences and believe their own eyes more. They're going to believe what a president says in a speech.
And the backdrop of these moments that we're looking at right now was the story that broke late yesterday about a batch of Epstein files that were not released by the DOJ, apparently withheld, that claimed the president was involved in some sort of assault of a minor. So that was swirling around as the president was on stage in the hall of the House getting clapped at by scared Republicans. So, Ed Luce, you have a piece that talks about Donald Trump's state of mind being a global risk. Explain.
So I think, as we've just been discussing, we're all very aware of his serial lying, his sort of compulsive lying, which in itself is not a sort of 25th Amendment thing. It doesn't prove you're irrational. But others encouraging you to believe your lies, now that's a whole different level of seriousness. And we saw with all those repeated standing ovations that is what the GOP as a whole is doing. Trump always chickens out, which is a phrase, an acronym coined by a colleague of mine, works when he understands the risks involved. So if he understands that, China has a bigger bazooka, it can shut off rare earths, he will then climb down because he's got good information. My concern is that with the sycophants, the sort of cabinet of Pyongyang sycophants that he's got around him, including Pete Hegseth as defense secretary, that as we are staring in the face of a possible Middle Eastern war of choice, that Trump is not being given the full facts. Now, that's his fault for selecting people who tell him what he wants to hear, not what he wants to know. But this could lead to a very, very consequential decision that could harm him, first of all. So I think my piece, although it might be seen as hostile, is actually a very helpful piece, which is you need truth tellers around you. Who are these truth tellers? Where are they? Because people who serve a president need to give an honest appraisal of the options in front of him. I don't think he's getting that, and therefore I don't think Trump is being served.
No, it's not normal what we saw last night.
Not being served. He needs good people around him. He needs a good person at the DHS, not somebody who lies repeatedly, not somebody that goes from scandal to scandal to scandal to scandal. He just needs good people around him. The job is too big for any one person, and it's too big for Donald Trump. And if he doesn't believe it, he needs to look at his approval ratings. And it's the same thing whether you're talking about Iran. If you're talking about Iran, whatever you're talking about, domestic issues, he needs people around him to help him pass legislation that will give him a lasting legacy.
U.S. national editor at Financial Times, Ed Luce, thank you so much. His new piece is online right now. An opinion columnist for the New York Times, David French. Thank you as well.